The crowd outside the post office buzzed with curiosity as Shola stumbled backward, her body trembling. She had dressed her finest that morning, her blue and white Ankara fabric glowing in the sun. She had walked down the dirt road, smiling, waving at neighbors, and telling anyone who would listen, "Today, my husband's package has arrived. Things will finally change for us." But the package wasn't filled with the treasures she had imagined. It didn't hold the money, clothes, and gifts she had spent years dreaming of. No, this package carried her husband's lifeless body. Shola's scream echoed through the small crowd that had gathered. Her legs buckled under her, and she crumpled to the ground, her head spinning. "No, no, this can't be true," she wailed, her voice breaking. The murmurs around her grew louder. "She sent him to his death," one woman said, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "Dio never wanted to leave, she made him," another added. Shola's tears streamed freely as her mind raced back to the moment she had first told Dio he needed to travel abroad. It had seemed like such a good idea then. It had felt like the solution to all their problems, but now, looking at his lifeless face, she couldn't breathe. Her world, once filled with hope and ambition, was now a wreck of grief and regret. Years earlier, Shola's life looked very different. She was a wife, a mother, and a small business owner. Things weren't perfect, but they were stable, and most importantly, they were happy. Shola had married Dio, her childhood sweetheart, in a simple ceremony at their village church. Dio was a taxi driver, and though his work didn't make them rich, it was enough to provide for their family. Every morning, Dio would wake up early, warm his engine, and hum a song while preparing for another long day of driving customers through the bustling streets. Shola, on the other hand, was a hairstylist. She ran a small shop in a local market where women would gather to get their hair done. Her hands worked magic, and her customers often left satisfied, returning week after week. Her earnings added to Dio's, and together they managed to keep their modest home running. Their daughters, Nike and Tiwa, were the pride of their lives. Nike, at 10, was serious and loved to read. Tiwa, only 7, was full of life and always laughing. The two girls adored each other and were inseparable. They were also brilliant in school, always coming home with glowing report cards. Shola's family lived in a small yellow bungalow with 2 bedrooms. It wasn't much, but it was home. They didn't have everything they wanted, but they had everything they needed. Meals were shared together, stories were told, and laughter echoed through the walls. Yet, for Shola, this life wasn't enough. Shola's discontent began the day she met Madame Mercy. It was an ordinary afternoon. Shola had gone to a nearby tailoring shop to sew matching dresses for Nike and Tiwa. The shop was larger than anything Shola had ever seen, filled with colorful fabrics and busy assistants rushing about. And then, there was Madame Mercy. She stood tall and confident, her clothes crisp and expensive. Her makeup was flawless, her jewelry glittering, and her voice commanding. Customers treated her with admiration, some even calling her Auntie Mercy with respect. Shola watched her in awe. Mercy wasn't just a tailor. She was a woman who had it all: money, power, and status. Shola felt a strange ache in her chest as she compared her own life to this woman's. She's everything I want to be, Shola thought, her hands clutching the fabric she had brought for her daughters. From that moment on, Shola couldn't stop thinking about Mercy. The image of Mercy's well-decorated shop, her shiny car parked outside, and her graceful demeanor haunted Shola's thoughts. It wasn't long before Shola decided she had to be like her. Shola's admiration for Madame Mercy soon turned into obsession. She convinced herself that working for Mercy was the key to achieving a better life. One day, Shola approached her nervously. "Madame Mercy," she began, her voice shaky. I want to be your apprentice. I want to learn from you. Mercy raised an eyebrow, amused by Shola's boldness. After a brief pause, she nodded. You can start tomorrow, she said. But be ready to work hard. Shola was thrilled. She threw herself into her new role, sweeping floors, running errands, and observing Mercy's every move. She believed she was getting closer to the life she dreamed of. But soon, Shola began to neglect her own business and her family. She spent more and more time at Mercy's shop, trying to emulate her. She borrowed money to buy new clothes, hoping to look the part of a successful woman. At home, things started to fall apart. Nike and Tiwa often went to school with messy hair and worn-out shoes. Dio, who was already tired from his job, began to pick up more of Shola's responsibilities. Shola, this isn't like you, Dio said one night as they lay in bed. The girls need you. I need you. I'm doing this for us, Dio, Shola replied sharply. One day, you'll thank me. Her words stung, but Dio didn't argue. He hoped she knew what she was doing. Shola's obsession with Madame Mercy only grew. She started spending money she didn't have, borrowing from friends and neighbors to keep up appearances. She wanted to dress like Mercy, talk like Mercy, and live like Mercy. Meanwhile, at home, Nike and Tiwa began to notice the changes. Their once cheerful mother was now always distracted, her temper short. Their meals were no longer the hot, delicious plates they were used to. Sometimes, there was barely enough food to go around. The neighbors started to talk. Isn't Shola a hairstylist? Why do her children look so neglected? Dio, too, was feeling the strain. He tried to keep the family afloat, but the cracks were becoming too big to ignore. He worked longer hours to provide for the family, often returning home exhausted. But the weight of Shola's absence was too much for him to bear. One evening, after a particularly tiring day, Dio returned home to find the girls sitting outside the house, waiting for him. Daddy, we're hungry, Tiwa said softly. Her large eyes filled with sadness. Didn't Mummy cook before she left? Dio asked, his voice laced with worry. Nike shook her head. Mummy didn't come home today. She said she was busy at the shop. Dio sighed heavily, his heart breaking for his children. He rummaged through the kitchen, managing to scrape together some leftover food for them. As the girls ate in silence, he wondered what had happened to the Shola he once knew. At the same time, Shola was busy attending a party with Madame Mercy and her wealthy clients. She had borrowed money to buy a new dress for the occasion, convinced that looking good was the key to success. As she laughed and danced, she pushed thoughts of her family aside. Things took a turn one fateful day when Shola overheard a phone conversation at Madame Mercy's shop. Mercy was speaking to her husband, who was living abroad. Yes, the money came in yesterday, Mercy said casually, twirling a pen in her hand. I'll buy the materials you mentioned. Thank you, my love. Shola's ears perked up. The pieces began to fall into place. Madame Mercy's glamorous lifestyle wasn't just the result of hard work. It was funded by her husband, who sent money from Europe. That night, Shola confronted Dio with an idea that had been brewing in her mind. You need to go abroad, she said bluntly, as they sat at the dinner table. Dio looked at her, confused. What are you talking about? Look at Mercy's husband, Shola continued, her tone firm. He went abroad, and now she has everything. We can have that too if you just go. Dio frowned. Shola, do you know how dangerous it is to travel that way? People die trying to cross to Europe. It's not as easy as you think. But Shola wouldn't listen. If you loved us, you'd do it. Real men take risks for their families, she said, her voice sharp. Her words stung deeply. Dio knew he didn't want to leave his family, but the constant pressure from Shola wore him down. After weeks of arguments and sleepless nights, he finally gave in. Dio sold his taxi, the family's only steady source of income. to fund his journey. He joined a group of travelers heading to Europe through the notorious Libya route. The journey was a living nightmare. The group traveled through the vast, unforgiving desert, where the heat during the day was blistering and the nights were freezing cold. Food and water were scarce, and those who fell behind were left to die. Dio watched in horror as men and women collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies swallowed by the endless dunes. The smugglers, who had promised safe passage, turned out to be ruthless. They packed the travelers into overcrowded trucks, beating anyone who dared to complain. Dio clung to the thought of his daughters to keep going. "This is for Nike and Tiwa," he repeated to himself like a mantra. "I must survive for them." After weeks of suffering, they finally reached Libya. But the ordeal was far from over. The travelers were herded into a cramped camp, treated like prisoners. Dio was forced to work long hours under harsh conditions, his body weakening with each passing day. After the grueling journey through the desert and the treacherous crossing of the Mediterranean Sea, Dio finally stepped foot in Europe. He had survived where many had not. But the relief of arriving in a new land was short-lived, replaced quickly by the harsh reality of being an illegal immigrant. Dio found himself in a crowded refugee camp on the outskirts of a bustling European city. The camp was a mix of hope and despair. Men and women who had endured unspeakable horrors on the journey now faced another challenge: survival in a foreign land. Dio had no papers, no money, and no idea where to begin. The first few weeks were the hardest. Dio slept on a thin mat in a crowded shelter, surrounded by strangers who, like him, were searching for a better life. Meals were scarce and came from charity organizations that distributed bread and soup once a day. The cold nights were brutal, and Dio often found himself clutching his thin blanket, praying to survive another day. He spent his days searching for work, knocking on doors, and pleading with factory owners and shopkeepers. Some offered him jobs, underpaid and grueling labor that barely provided enough to eat. Others turned him away, refusing to risk hiring someone without legal documents. Dio worked wherever he could, loading heavy crates in warehouses, cleaning streets, and washing dishes in small restaurants. Meanwhile, back in Nigeria, Shola's demands grew louder and more relentless. "Dio, it's been months. You've been there all this time, and we haven't seen a kobo from you," she said during one of her calls. "What are you even doing there?" Dio's voice was weak as he replied, "Shola, I'm trying. I work all day just to survive. It's not what you think here." But Shola's frustration blinded her to his struggles. "Stop making excuses, Dio. Look at Mercy's husband. He's abroad, and he sends her money every month. Why can't you do the same?" Dio wanted to explain that not all journeys turned out the same. He wanted to tell her about the men he had met, who had spent years in Europe without being able to send anything home. But he couldn't find the words. Instead, he hung up the phone, the weight of his failure crushing him. As the years dragged on, Dio's health began to decline. The harsh conditions, lack of proper food, and endless stress took a toll on his body. He often thought of his daughters, Nike and Tiwa, and wondered if they even remembered him. "This is not what I imagined," Dio whispered to himself one cold night as he sat under a bridge, shivering. "This is not the life I wanted for my family." By the 5th year of living in Europe, Dio's body could no longer keep up with the harsh demands of his life. The long hours of back-breaking labor, combined with malnutrition and the stress of being undocumented, had weakened him to the point where he could hardly stand. One morning, as he walked to a construction site where he had found temporary work, Dio collapsed on the street. Passers-by ignored him, assuming he was just another homeless man. By the time someone stopped to help, it was too late. Dio had passed away. The news of his death reached his small circle of friends. fellow immigrants who had shared his struggles and knew his heartache. They were devastated. Dio had often spoken about his daughters, Nike and Tiwa, and how he dreamed of giving them a better life. Moved by his love for his family, the friends pooled their resources to send his body back to Nigeria. It was no easy task. Transporting a body across countries required money and paperwork, both of which were in short supply. But they persisted, driven by a sense of duty to honor Dio's sacrifice. Back in Nigeria, Shola received the call she had been waiting for. "Madam, there's a package from Europe for you," the voice on the other end of the line said. Shola's heart leaped with joy. She told everyone in the neighborhood, "Dio has finally sent something. Things are about to change." She imagined bundles of money, expensive gifts, and maybe even a letter filled with promises for the future. When the crate arrived, Shola wasted no time opening it, but as the lid was lifted, her world shattered. Inside lay Dio's lifeless body, his face pale and sunken. Her scream pierced the air, drawing a crowd of neighbors. "No! No, this can't be real!" Shola wailed, collapsing to the ground. "This is not what I wanted." The murmurs around her began almost immediately. "She's the one who sent him to his death," someone said. "Dio didn't want to go, but she pushed him," another added. Shola barely heard them. Her mind was filled with images of Dio, his smile, his laughter, his love for their family. And now, he was gone. Dio's death sent shockwaves through the small community. Neighbors gathered to pay their respects, but the mood was far from sympathetic. Many blamed Shola for what had happened. She wanted to live like Madame Mercy, and now look at where it's gotten her, one woman said, shaking her head. Shola's daughters, Nike and Tiwa, were devastated. The girls had idolized their father, and losing him left a void they couldn't fill. Nike, now a teenager, spoke up for the first time. "You sent Daddy to his death," she said coldly, her eyes filled with anger. "You cared more about yourself than us or him." Tiwa, unable to process her grief, withdrew completely, spending hours locked in her room. Shola's once busy life came to a standstill. She no longer visited Madame Mercy's shop or attended the parties she once loved. Instead, she spent her days in silence, haunted by memories of Dio and the choices that had led to his death. Years passed, and Nike and Tiwa grew into strong, successful women. With the help of Dio's friends abroad, who felt an obligation to honor his memory, the girls completed their education and built lives their father would have been proud of. Shola, however, remained trapped in a cycle of guilt and regret. Her once beautiful face had aged prematurely, her eyes filled with a sadness that never left. One day, Nike and Tiwa returned to Nigeria to visit their mother. As they entered the small bungalow, they were struck by how much had changed. The house felt smaller, emptier, and Shola herself looked frail and tired. Together, they visited Dio's grave. As they stood before the simple headstone, Nike spoke softly. "Daddy's sacrifice wasn't in vain," she said, tears streaming down her face. "We've made something of ourselves, and we'll always remember what he did for us." Shola wept silently, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her choices had caused so much pain. The story ends with a message. Be content with what we have, and to avoid making decisions driven by envy and greed. It's a call to value the people in our lives before it's too late. If this story moved you, inspired you, imagine the incredible stories we'll share next. Please subscribe to my channel, hit the notification bell, like, and drop a comment for me. Your support makes it possible to keep these stories alive, so don't miss out.